Hello, friends. We are interested in the geography of our views, so please like and write in the comments from which city are you watching us, and were there loud stories of betrayal in your city? Share your stories with us. Maybe the next betrayal story will be from your city. And we start. Scott Branner is tired from the day. The monotonous hum of transformers was still ringing in my ears after returning from work. He worked as an electrician for 12 hours straight, fixing a blackout on the other side of town. Driven by a sense of responsibility, Scott stayed late at the site until he finally repaired the damaged transformer. Already at dusk, smeared with grease and dirt, he restored the power supply. The clients, an elderly married couple, thanked him profusely, and it was worth the fatigue. Scott smiled as he shook their hands. It was moments like these that made him love his job. After that, he packed up his instrument and drove home alone across the city, thinking only about a hot shower and dinner. He has always been like this, a reliable person you can rely on. And now, driving up to his house in a quiet suburb in the evening, he dreamed of a quiet evening with his family. The headlights of a pickup truck snatched a familiar facade from the darkness. A cozy one-story house with a well-groomed lawn and a lit porch. This house was the fruit of 12 years of hard work. Scott was proud of him as he was of his family. His wife, Haley, has always supported him. Or at least, she supported me until recently. In recent months, she seemed to have moved away. Scott chalked it up to everyday fatigue or his own workload, but sometimes at night he caught himself thinking that an invisible wall had arisen between them. He turned off the engine and closed his eyes for a moment, running his hands over his face. 38 years old was not that old, but after a long day of work, every muscle aches from tension. Nothing, I'll rest now, he thought, getting out of the car and slamming the door. A bunch of keys and a small flashlight jingled in his pocket. The night turned out to be moonless, and only distant lanterns on a nearby street cast a pale light. He was met on the porch by an unexpected guest, or rather, no longer a guest, but an inhabitant of the house, his younger brother. Cody Branner sat on the porch railing, smoking, squinting into the headlights. He had recently turned 30 and had been living with them temporarily for the past few months. After leaving prison, Cody had no money or a home of his own, and Scott, as the older brother, felt obligated to help start his life over. "Hey, brother," Scott nodded, walking up the steps. "Can't sleep?" Cody jumped onto the porch and put out his cigarette on the metal trash can. In the semi-darkness, Scott noticed a grin on his face, slightly cocky, almost boyish. "Yes, I'm waiting for you," Cody answered light-heartedly. "I thought maybe I needed help with the housework." "Haley said you'll be there soon." Scott looked at his brother. He was dressed in an old leather jacket and jeans. The shadow of stubble ran along the corners of his jaw. The eyes sparkled slyly. Cody had always been a master at hiding his thoughts behind a veneer of cheeky charm. As a child, this helped him get out of trouble. But now, after prison, standing on the porch of Scott's house, he looked almost the same as then, not a drop of shame, as if he had not broken the law and was not the one who needed help. "Thanks, but everything is fine now," Scott responded, taking out the keys. "Where is Haley?" Inside, Cody stepped aside, letting his brother through the door. "He's preparing something tasty. You are lucky with your wife. She is just gold." Scott smiled as he turned the key in the lock. He loved it when his brother and wife got along. Previously, they did not know each other very well. When Scott married Haley, Cody had already begun to slide downhill, appearing less and less at family gatherings. Prison completely alienated him from his family. But now, it seemed, was a chance to establish family relationships. At least that's what Scott thought when he offered Cody a room in his house. "I know," he said proudly, opening the door. "She's wonderful to me." The house was greeted with the warm light of lamps and the aroma of roast. In the hallway, Scott took off his heavy boots, feeling how pleasant fatigue was being replaced by the anticipation of rest. Cody followed, throwing his jacket on the hanger. A quiet hum could be heard coming from the kitchen. Haley liked to hum to herself while preparing dinner. Scott stopped in the kitchen doorway, leaning his shoulder on the doorframe, and just stared for a few seconds. Haley stood at the stove with her back to him, stirring something in a frying pan. The wife's figure slender, feminine was outlined by the soft light of the lamp. Brown hair is gathered in a messy bun at the back of the head. She looked so dear and loved that Scott's heart sank with an influx of tenderness. "Hello, dear," he said quietly. Haley jumped in surprise and turned around. For a moment, there was a strange look in her eyes, as if she had been taken by surprise. But the very next second she smiled when she saw her husband. "Oh, you're already home," she said quietly, wiping her hands on a towel. "I didn't hear the car drive up. How was your day?" Scott walked into the kitchen and kissed his wife on the cheek. Her skin was cool and she seemed a little tense. He chalked it up to the surprise of his appearance. Apparently, she was lost in thought and didn't hear. "I'm as tired as a dog," he admitted, inhaling the aroma of dinner. "But now everything is fine." "What does it smell like?" "Divine." Haley smiled contentedly and turned to the stove. "Your favorite roast beef and potatoes." He will have time to get there while you change clothes. Then Cody came through the kitchen door. He moved silently, and Scott noticed how Haley tensed slightly when she heard footsteps behind her. However, when she saw Cody, she relaxed again. The wife exchanged a quick glance with her brother-in-law, almost an instant, but Scott, with some sixth sense, caught it. There was something more than just friendliness in that look. Perhaps gratitude, or a conspiracy. Scott wasn't sure what it was, but for some reason he felt uneasy. "Will you give me a piece of roast?" Cody inquired with a grin, sitting down at the kitchen table. "Of course," Haley answered with a smile, but as Scott noticed, a little forced. Enough for everyone. Scott also sat down at the table, reaching out to the jug of cold water. Thirst reminded him that he had been working all day without a break. "What a day," he said, pouring himself a drink. "I barely made it home. Thanks for making dinner, Hale." "I'm trying for you," she answered warmly and ran her hand over his shoulder, but the movement seemed mechanical, without the same tenderness. Then she immediately pulled away and began to put the roast on plates. Scott watched his wife. Everything seemed as usual, but something still seemed wrong. Maybe he's just screwing himself over. After all, everyone has bad days. "How is it at work?" Haley asked, breaking the pause. Scott began to talk about the breakdown of the transformer, trying to calm the anxiety that had arisen within him. Gradually, the conversation at the table became livelier. Cody interjected jokes. Haley smiled. Outwardly, it's the most ordinary family scene. But Scott couldn't forget that strange look between his wife and brother. After dinner, full and a little relaxed, Scott leaned back in his chair. Haley stood up, collecting the dishes, and Cody immediately stood up to help her, taking the plates from her hands. Their fingers touched for a moment, and both froze almost imperceptibly. For some reason, this little thing caught Scott's eye. How quickly Haley pulled her hand away, how her cheeks flushed. She lowered her gaze in embarrassment, and Cody grinned with his signature reckless grin. It seemed, Scott thought, just an awkward moment. He stood up, suddenly feeling a strange tension in the air, and took the empty plates from his brother. "Go, I'll clean it myself," he suggested firmly. "You are sure?" Haley looked at him, biting her lip. Concern flashed in her eyes. "Absolutely," Scott nodded. "You've both done enough already. Rest." Cody shrugged. "As you know, brother." Scott took the dishes into the kitchen, including the water in the sink. The jets covered the plates with foam, and he watched furtively through the doorway. Cody and Haley walked into the living room. The brother said something quietly. The wife listened with her arms crossed over her chest. Scott couldn't hear the words over the sound of the water, but he saw Cody lean closer to Haley, saying something in her ear. The wife flushed and took a step back, smiling tightly. Then she glanced towards the kitchen to see if Scott was coming. He quickly looked away to the sink, feeling his heart suddenly pound. What nonsense! Cody just loves to joke and flirt with everyone. That's his way of communicating. And yet, standing in the kitchen, Scott felt suspicion arise in his chest. Barely formed, absurd. He himself immediately tried to crush him. This is his brother and his wife. There can be nothing reprehensible. After a couple of minutes, he turned off the water and dried his hands. In the living room, the TV was already on. Footage of some old action movie was flashing across the screen. Cody lounged in a chair, and Haley sat on the couch with her legs tucked under her. There was a decent distance between them, nothing unusual. Scott took the remote control and turned up the volume, settling down next to his wife. She leaned against his shoulder as usual, but he felt that she was tense. Scott put his arm around his wife's shoulders, trying to push away stupid thoughts. However, there was an itch of anxiety inside a dull itch under the skin, like an approaching thunderstorm. He glanced at Cody. He was staring at the TV, but the corners of his lips still held the shadow of a satisfied smile. It was as if he was very pleased with himself, or with what had happened during the evening. The night was thickening outside the windows. The dim light of the lamp was reflected on the glass, and behind it were shadows, long and unsteady. After a long day of work, exhaustion finally began to overcome Scott. He felt himself drifting off to sleep right there on the sofa, his eyelids filling with lead. Haley stood up gently, her movement smooth, almost inaudible. Having taken off her dressing gown, she was left in lace underwear soft peach color, with thin straps, emphasizing the curves of her figure. She stretched for a moment, as if not noticing that there was someone else in the room besides her husband. The light from the floor lamp slid across her skin, catching on her collarbones and thin waistline. Cody twitched noticeably and cast a quick, predatory glance at her out of the corner of his eye short, but Scott caught it. This did not escape him either. "Honey, I'm going to go take a shower," she said in a casual tone, as if nothing unusual had happened. "Don't stay too late either. You'll have to get up early tomorrow." Scott nodded and rubbed his eyes. "Yes, of course. I'll be right there." The wife disappeared into the corridor, her steps echoing in the silence. Soon the sound of water came from the bathroom uniform, soothing, almost hypnotic. But Scott was uneasy at heart. He stretched his stiff shoulders, and looked at his brother. He switched the channel to a football match, sat down comfortably, and seemed to no longer pay attention to Scott. "I guess I'll go too," Scott said, getting up, eyes stick together. "Come on, good night," Cody responded without even turning his head from the TV. Scott headed towards the bedroom, fighting the uneasy feeling in his stomach as he went. He tried to convince himself that all this was just the fruit of overwork. But images from the evening popped up in my head. A quick glance between Haley and Cody, their hands touching, whispers in the living room. And now she was in her underwear, as if she hadn't noticed that he wasn't the only one in the room. He pursed his lips, suppressing his irritation and growing doubt. There's no reason to be jealous, no. Haley never gave a reason. He lay down on the bed, trying to drive away disturbing thoughts, and soon fell into a restless sleep, full of vague images, shadows, and quiet, ominous laughter coming from somewhere behind the wall. A few days after that evening, Scott's anxiety began to dissipate. It was as if the shadow hanging over his thoughts began to dissolve into the daily routine. He convinced himself that he had misinterpreted the looks and gestures, probably due to the fatigue accumulated by weeks of stress and overwork. Haley and Cody behaved as usual. During the day, they each went about their own business. In the evening, they gathered for dinner, talked about the weather, news, and sometimes jokes. Everything looked calm, even too calm, as if life had returned to normal again. One such evening, after a late shift, Scott returned home exhausted. It was already night outside the windows, the street was quiet, only the lanterns softly poured yellow light onto the deserted sidewalk. The door opened, and the warm, cozy smell of home dinner and washed clothes enveloped him completely. Haley greeted him with care, smiling as if she had been waiting for him all day. At dinner, she was especially attentive. She looked into his eyes, listened with interest to his short stories about work, talked about his neighbors, about some cute video with a kitten that she saw in the morning. It seemed that everything had returned to its place. Even her voice sounded softer than usual, almost soothing. Scott relaxed. For the first time in days, he truly felt at home. Later, when he had already changed his clothes and was about to go to bed, wearing a t-shirt and old sleep pants, Haley entered the bedroom with a mug in her hands. Steam rose above it, filling the room with a light aroma of herbs. "Drink, my love," she said softly, holding out the mug. Her voice was low, almost whispering. "You need to relax after work." Scott accepted the mug gratefully. Her fingers slid over his shoulder, a light, fleeting touch that sent chills through him. She smiled and headed towards the bathroom. "I'll quickly take a shower," she added over her shoulder. "Just drink, don't wait for me." The bathroom door closed, and soon the sound of water was heard, smooth, stable, like the sound of a distant waterfall. Scott was left in a dimly lit bedroom, lit only by the dim light of a night lamp. He sat down on the edge of the bed, feeling his legs weaken from fatigue. In my hands, the mug was warm, almost hot. He inhaled its aroma. Mint, yes, but not only. Something else was hidden in the smell, tart, slightly sweet, with a hint of bitterness. Unexpectedly complex, unusual aroma. He took the first sip, scalding, but pleasant. The taste seemed familiar and foreign at the same time. Mint, maybe lemon balm. But then there's a strange, dense note, like a root or bark. Something bitter and earthy. Scott frowned, looked at the mug, then shrugged. Probably just a new collection. Haley would sometimes buy something interesting at the pharmacy or herbal store. He took a few more sips. Warmth spread through his chest, as if someone had lit a soft lantern inside him. Calm covered him completely. Even thoughts that had been scurrying around restlessly just a minute ago began to slow down and subside. But along with this feeling came something else. Heaviness. First in the shoulders, then through the centuries. He blinked, suddenly realizing that his vision had become blurry, as if in a fog. The whole room seemed to float a little. My head suddenly began to spin, not sharply, but noticeably. A slight buzz appeared in his temples, as if he was overtired, or as if he had drunk not herbal tea, but a couple of glasses of strong whiskey. Scott put the mug on the nightstand, but his fingers trembled, and he almost dropped it. My palms were sweating. He ran his hand over his face, but the feeling of futility did not go away. On the contrary, it grew. His whole body felt heavy, as if he were lying under a wet blanket. The words in my head began to blur. My consciousness seemed to be stuck in the thick syrup of sleep. Strange. A thought flashed, and then she disappeared somewhere. Wow, it's knocking me out. He was surprised, trying to get up, but his legs became weak. Scott collapsed with his back on the bed, smiling at his own helplessness. This is what they call relaxing. Apparently, he was completely overtired. The sound of water in the shower calmed and lulled me to sleep. Scott didn't notice how he fell into a deep sleep, not even waiting for Haley to come out of the bathroom. He lay down without undressing, without covering himself, and did not notice how he closed his eyes. The room, the bed, the sound of water, everything disappeared. All that was left was the feeling of falling, not terrible, but somehow irreversible. It was as if he was falling not into sleep, but into something else, deeper, darker. And before consciousness completely turned off, the last, barely perceptible flashed through my head. Why was the taste bitter? A few minutes later, Haley came out of the bathroom and looked into the bedroom. Scott lay on the bed on top of the blanket, snoring in his sleep. The wife quietly approached. His wife's lips touched his forehead, a light, cool kiss. "Good night," Haley whispered, barely audible. Scott wanted to answer, but his tongue would not obey. Consciousness floated. He barely opened his eyelids. The figure of his wife bent over him, her face indistinguishable in the twilight, only the sparkle of her eyes. Or did he imagine it? He fell into a heavy sleep again, not having time to fully formulate the idea of what was strange this evening. The room became quiet. Before completely passing out, Scott felt as if the door to the bedroom quietly opened and someone's shadow slid along the wall. For a moment he heard muffled whispers and the creaking of the bed, as if someone was next to his wife in the bedroom. But there was no strength to move or make sure that this was not a trick of the imagination. The darkness closed completely, hiding him from disturbing thoughts. The next evening, Scott returned home a little earlier than usual. All day he felt somehow strange. He could not remember how he fell asleep last night, and the morning began with a heavy head, as if after a party, although he knew for sure that he did not drink anything except tea. His whole body ached, and in his memory there was an emptiness between the time he put the mug on the nightstand and how he woke up in the morning in the same clothes, under a blanket, which, it seemed, had been covered without him. Several times he wanted to ask Haley a question. Did she notice how he fell asleep? Did he say anything? Did he stagger? But each time he changed his mind. Something was holding him back. Maybe he didn't want to seem suspicious, or he was afraid to hear the answer. In the evening, when the house was already dark, and the smell of stewed vegetables and baked meat was coming from the kitchen, Haley greeted him again with a warm smile. At dinner, she was as friendly as always, even a little playful. She talked about a chance meeting with a friend, laughed when he got confused in the story about a strange situation at work. It seemed that the day passed in peace, and there was no sign of alarm. After dinner, Scott went upstairs, changed into his home clothes, and, approaching the bed, suddenly remembered yesterday's tea, its taste, bitterness, drowsiness, and the silence into which he fell. He sat on the edge of the bed and pretended to read messages on his phone. About 10 minutes later, Haley entered the bedroom with her usual, almost ritualistic soft smile. In his hands is a mug. Thin ceramics, steam rises in the air like a snake. Everything is exactly the same as yesterday. "Here, my love," she said, holding out the mug. "To relax. You look tired." Scott took it, feeling something tighten inside him. He looked at the liquid, a cloudy green infusion, with the same subtle aroma of mint and something else. He nodded and squeezed out a grateful smile. "Thank you. You take care as always." "Of course," Haley said, smiling. "I'm worried about you." She slid her hand over his shoulder and walked into the bathroom, taking her time. The door slammed shut softly, and soon the familiar sound of water was heard again. Scott stared at the mug for a while longer. Then, carefully, he placed it on the nightstand behind the flower pot. Without taking a sip, he pretended to stretch, turned off the overhead light, and lay down, turning to the wall. His breathing became even, as if he was already beginning to fall asleep. The splashing of water could be heard from behind the closed door. Then silence. 5 minutes, maybe 10. The bathroom door opened slightly, and Haley walked into the dim bedroom. He felt her steps careful, almost silent. She stopped by the bed, and he heard the nightstand move and the mug being carefully taken. There was a pause in the room. He fell asleep. Scott woke up suddenly in the middle of the night, as if someone had brought him out of a deep sleep to the surface. The room was pitch black. Only a thin strip of light came through the slightly open door from the corridor. He didn't immediately understand why he woke up. His head was still heavy, as if in a fog. "My mouth is dry." He lay there for a few seconds, staring blankly at the ceiling, trying to remember what had woken him up. There was silence in his ears, broken only by his own heartbeat and the soft, ticking sound of the wall clock. 2:30 a.m., the dial hands gleamed dimly in the darkness. Scott was about to roll over and go back to sleep when he heard someone else's sound, a quiet, barely audible moan. He became wary. The sound was repeated, a drawn-out exhalation, almost a whisper, and he seemed to be coming from the end of the bedroom. "What the—" Scott thought, and suddenly a cold foreboding burned his chest. He froze, listening. Again the rustle of fabric, a quiet cry, quickly suppressed. Scott slowly turned his head towards the sound. In the semi-darkness, the eye at first could not discern anything, but gradually vague outlines began to appear in the corner of the bedroom. There were two dark silhouettes at the foot of the bed. One is female, recognizable by the curve of her waist and disheveled hair. The second one is higher and wider. They moved, intertwined together. A quiet, heavy breathing reached Scott's consciousness. It took him several long seconds to realize what he saw. Haley, his wife, nude, judging by the outline of her body in the dim light, and Cody. He recognized his brother by his distinctive profile, short cropped hair, and a tattoo on his shoulder, which he saw when the silhouette turned sideways in the moonlight from the window. Scott's heart slammed into his chest like a hammer. Bile rose in my throat. He watched, unable to move. The wife and brother were absorbed in each other, completely confident that no one could see them. Haley straddled Cody, her bare hips moving rhythmically. She bit her lip, holding back her moans, and Cody stroked her back and breasts with noisy breathing, forgetting about everything in animal passion. Scott felt a hurricane of emotions erupt inside him all at once: disbelief, shock, rage, pain. It seemed that just a little more, and he would scream and attack them. A lump formed in my throat. He let out a breath, but covered his mouth with his hand just in time, afraid to give away his presence. His heart was beating so loudly that it seemed they should hear it. This is a dream. No, a nightmare. Scott thought feverishly. He clenched his teeth until his cheekbones ached. An unimaginable betrayal unfolded before my eyes in the darkness, making me want to scream and cry at the same time. Haley leaned towards Cody's face and began to breathe faster. He groaned muffledly, grabbing her hips. Scott's vision swam with anger. How dare they? On the marital bed, next to him. At some point, Haley croaked through a quiet groan. "Just don't stop." These words cut to the quick. Scott couldn't resist and took a deep breath. The floorboard under the mattress creaked barely audibly from his involuntary movement. The silhouettes froze. Haley turned sharply towards the marital bed. Scott immediately closed his eyes, trying to breathe evenly, as if he was still sleeping soundly. He was lying on the very edge of the bed, and in the darkness it was impossible to see whether his eyes were open or not. But he was afraid that the noise of his heart would give him away, it was beating so deafeningly. Nothing happened for several endless seconds. Then he heard his wife's muffled whisper. "He's sleeping. Continue." Cody hissed something in response, unintelligible, most likely a curse, but then Scott again caught the sounds of their renewed movements. They continued, trying to be even quieter. Scott was afraid to look again, but his hearing had sharpened. Now every quiet sigh and rustle sounded like thunder in his ears. He clenched his fists until his fingers hurt. Tears of rage welled up in his eyes, but he blinked them away. Inside, everything was boiling and screaming to take out the insult, to tear the traitors to pieces on the spot. Pictures of the past mercilessly appeared before my eyes. Haley in a wedding dress, beaming with happiness, their first kiss in the summer rain, cozy evenings when she fell asleep on his shoulder. All this now turned out to be a lie and ended in one terrible moment. But the mind, with all its might, kept us from recklessness. He slowly opened his eyes again. The picture changed. Cody had already risen, turning Haley onto her back right on the marital bed, next to Scott, who was barely breathing from anger. The mattress beneath them swayed, and Scott felt this movement with his whole body. They were literally making love a few tens of centimeters from him. Haley screamed softly, but Cody quickly covered her mouth with his hand. "Hush. Do you want him to wake up?" he whispered with a grin. "He won't wake up." "Not after what I gave him," she answered in the same whisper, breathing heavily. "Come on quickly." Scott almost shook at these words. She herself confirms this. His wife deliberately put something in his tea so that he could sleep with his brother under his nose. A wave of icy rage swept through Scott's body. He could no longer stand what was happening, and yet he understood. If he snapped now, then it was unknown how it would end. Cody, although younger, is physically stronger, and more desperate criminals like him have no inhibitions. And Scott had no plan other than blind rage. No, I had to think about everything first. Scott took a deep breath and forced himself to close his eyes again. Gradually, he stopped responding to sounds. He repeated to himself like a mantra, "Not now. Think cold. Not now." It is unknown how much time has passed, it seems like an eternity. Finally, the moans died down, and Cody's whispers and muffled chuckles were heard. Then stepped someone, judging by the heaviness of his gait. A brother came out of the bedroom. Scott heard cautious footsteps retreating down the corridor. After another minute, the bed creaked softly as Haley stood up. She went to the door, closed it, probably making sure that the guest had gone to his room, and returned. The mattress sank again under her weight. The wife lay down next to her husband. Scott felt her nearby, heard rapid breathing. the smell of sweat and something else sweet and alien. He lay motionless, continuing to pretend that he was sleeping. Everything was seething inside. I wanted to jump up and scream in her face, but he restrained himself. Haley gently nudged him in the side. "Scott, are you sleeping?" she called quietly. He didn't answer, breathing evenly. Then the wife confidently turned on her side and closed her eyes, as if nothing had happened, settling down next to him. Her hand even lay on his chest, as if in a dream she was looking for intimacy with her husband. A lump of bile rose in Scott's throat. How does she have the nerve to pretend to be a loving wife after everything? Scott spent the rest of the night without sleeping a wink. The heat of betrayal pulsated in his temples. He could no longer deny the obvious. His brother and his wife slept with each other, and they tried to keep him a fool by poisoning him with sleeping pills. In the morning, when the first gray rays began to break through the curtains, Scott was still lying with his eyes open, feeling something inside being destroyed. But in this ruin, a new feeling arose, cold, calculating, displacing pain. It's time for retribution. Early in the morning, Scott lay in bed with his eyes open. It was just beginning to turn gray outside the window. The birds were not singing yet. Haley slept next to him, peacefully wrapped in a blanket, her face looking as serene as it always did in the morning. But everything changed for Scott. Her appearance, her housecoat, her hair tied up in a bun, now seemed to Scott like a mask behind, which was hiding a completely different person. Just yesterday, he would never have doubted this sweet, homely picture, but now he saw only a deceitful facade. For several minutes, he silently looked at the ceiling, gathering his courage. The heart no longer beat as it did at night. Over the rest of the night, it fizzled out, turning the flames of rage into cold ashes. Now Scott felt strangely numb and clear at the same time. Careful not to wake his wife, he sat up on the bed. My head was a little dizzy, a hangover from sleeping pills. My throat was sore from thirst. He glanced at the nightstand. There was still an unfinished mug of yesterday's tea. A couple of sips of cooled infusion darkened at the bottom. Scott reached over and, pretending to just take the phone, quietly grabbed the mug. He brought it to his nose and sniffed it carefully. The barely perceptible bitter smell is not just mint. Something foreign was clearly in the drink. He quietly stood up and tiptoed into the bathroom, closed the door. Then he quickly poured the rest of the tea from the mug into a small empty cream jar that stood on the shelf. He screwed the cap on tightly and hid the jar in the pocket of his work jacket. Looking at his reflection in the mirror, Scott barely recognized himself. Pale face, dark circles under the eyes, pursed lips. "Calm down," he said quietly to his reflection. "Calm down, just a little more." When he returned to the bedroom, Haley was still asleep. Scott forced himself to lie back down, even though it was disgusting to be around her now. But it was necessary to play the role to the end. An hour later, Haley stirred and opened her eyes. Seeing that her husband had also woken up, she smiled tenderly as usual. Scott gave her a forced smile, hoping she looked natural. "Good morning," she whispered, stretching. "Did you sleep well?" Scott swallowed the lump in his throat and said, "Yes, like death." His own ambiguous phrase turned everything inside him, but outwardly he tried to appear half asleep and serene. Haley didn't seem to suspect anything. On the contrary, she looked relieved. "Indeed," she smiled more relaxed. "You didn't even snore today." Scott remained silent, pretending to be busy getting out of bed. He felt sick from his wife's proximity, but he pretended to be tired and frozen. In the kitchen, while Haley was preparing breakfast, Cody joined them. He showed up a little later than usual, with damp hair from a shower and fresh clothes. The brother looked cheerful and even somehow smug. Scott held his breath and met his gaze, trying to find even a hint of embarrassment. But there was nothing, just a cheeky grin, as always. "Good morning, people," Cody said cheerfully, settling down at the table. "How did you sleep?" Out of the corner of his eye, Scott noticed Haley jerking her head at her brother, giving a quick warning glance. Perhaps she considered the question tactless. Cody seemed to be enjoying the situation. "Thanks, great," Scott replied reservedly, pouring himself some coffee. I had a great night's sleep. Well, great, Cody said with a grin. He took an apple from the table and took a bite with a crunch. Yesterday, you looked like a squeezed lemon. Haley noisily placed a plate of omelet on the table, interrupting further conversation. Eat, or it'll get cold, she said sharply, trying to sound more cheerful. Everyone has a lot to do today. Scott met his wife's gaze. She batted her eyelashes and began to put the omelet on plates, avoiding looking into his eyes. Tension was in the air, but no one except him seemed to notice it. Scott ate with all his might, almost unable to taste it. He never looked in his brother's direction, fearing that he would not be able to restrain himself, and that something would betray his hatred. Inside, he was already forming a clear plan of action. The first step is to collect evidence. He couldn't afford to just anymore feel something is wrong. We needed facts, real material. The morning conversation at the table finally convinced him. These two have no idea about anything. They sat opposite and behaved naturally too naturally. We laughed at some nonsense on TV and discussed plans for the weekend. Haley briefly asked how he slept and didn't even flinch when he heard the answer. Great, thanks for the tea. She nodded, satisfied, and went back to her omelet. And Cody, as usual, sipped his coffee without looking up. We're sure you fooled me. Scott thought gloomily. Well, so much the worse for them. He carefully poured the remaining tea from the mug into a small plastic container, the one he usually used for samples. He closed the lid tightly, wrapped it in a bag, and put it in the bag between the papers. On his way to work, he turned aside to a small building near an industrial zone. There are no signs, just a neat door with a lab sign. Mike worked here, a former classmate, and now the owner of a private laboratory to which Scott more than once brought soil or water samples at the request of clients. When he entered, the room was quietly humming equipment and smelled of solvents and coffee. Mike was sitting at the computer, wearing headphones. Hearing the door slam, he turned around. Surprise showed on his face immediately. Scott, never mind. I haven't seen you for a long time. Is there something wrong with the orders? Not really, Scott answered, glancing around. I need your help. Informally. Yeah, Mike took off his headphones, turning to him. Sounds intriguing. What do you have? Scott took out a container and placed it on the table. We need to check this liquid for the presence of something foreign. Maybe sedatives, tranquilizers, or, I don't know, even something stronger. Just don't say a word to anyone, okay? Mike raised his eyebrows. Seriously? Scott, you know I don't work in forensics. What is this for work? Is someone poisoning plants? Not for work, Scott said dully. This is personal. Very. Just tell me if you can or not. Mike took a closer look at him. Scott looked tired and tense, but there was a cold focus in his eyes, not hysteria, but determination. This is the look of a man who has found the thread and now won't let go until he unravels everything completely. Okay, Mike nodded slowly. I owe you. I'll do a quick analysis. The results will be available later this evening. I'll call. Only for me. To a personal number. And no last names. Acknowledged, Agent 07. Mike grinned, but not as lightly as usual. I hope you didn't get into shit. Scott smiled slightly, more for show than sincerity. I'm not sure yet, but I'll find out soon. He turned around and walked out, the door behind him closing softly, almost silently. Outside, everything seemed as usual, passers-by, cars, gray sky. But inside, everything was already different. He took the first step towards the truth. Now all I had to do was wait. What exactly is being mixed into his tea? The rest of the working day passed in a blur. Scott mechanically twisted the nuts and pulled the wires, thinking only about the upcoming evening. He had already figured out what he would do: install a hidden camera in the bedroom. And he will write down everything that happens. He needed irrefutable evidence. Around lunchtime, he quietly left the office and went to an electronics store. I bought a miniature surveillance camera with a sound recording function. This one will fit anywhere and is completely invisible. In addition, it can be connected to a smartphone for remote viewing. In the evening, returning home a little earlier than usual, Scott found Haley in the kitchen. She was preparing dinner and looked lost in thought. Cody was not at home, perhaps he went out for a walk or to do his own business. This was just in time. "You're early." Haley raised her eyebrows in surprise when he entered. "How was your day?" "Yes," Scott responded vaguely, placing his bag of tools by the door. "Released earlier. I decided to do a couple of small electrical things at home, otherwise I didn't have time. How are you?" "It's normal." She looked at him carefully, as if looking for signs of strangeness. "You're kind of quiet today." Scott forced himself to smile. "Tired, so quiet." "It's okay, Hale." "What's for dinner?" "Smells delicious." The answer seemed to satisfy her. She turned to the stove. "Your favorite pasta. It will be ready in 10 minutes." "Great," Scott nodded. "In the meantime, I'll check the wiring in the bedroom. The lamp is blinking." He tried to speak as casually as possible, although his heart was beating wildly at that moment. This was an important point, positioning the camera without Haley noticing. The wife just nodded, busy stirring the sauce. Scott, trying not to rush, walked into the bedroom. The room, the scene of a nightmare, greeted him with the usual twilight. It was already getting dark outside, and the last rays of the setting sun were breaking through the curtains. He closed the bedroom door and quickly pulled a tiny camera out of his pocket. I thought for a few seconds and attached it to the curtain rod, drowning it in the folds of the fabric. From there was a full view of the bed. I turned on the power and made sure through the application on my phone that the camera was showing normally. An image appeared on the screen. Here is the bed, bedside tables, part of the closet, everything is fine. Haley's footsteps were heard in the kitchen. Scott barely had time to put the phone in his pocket when the door opened slightly and his wife looked out. "Eat soon. Are you almost finished?" "Yes, now," he responded with the most casual air, turning away from the window. For show, he reached out to the sconce on the wall as if checking contact. "Everything is fine. The contact just went away. Now I'll go get a screwdriver and fix it." Haley looked around the room suspiciously, but did not notice anything unusual in the dimness. "Okay, just not for long," she said, closing the door. As soon as her footsteps disappeared, Scott exhaled. "My heart finally slowed down. The camera is installed. Now the hardest thing remained to wait patiently." At dinner, he was again quieter than water, lower than the grass. Even the sound of cutlery hitting a plate seemed to irritate his tense nerves. He ate slowly, intently, as if chewing not his food, but his thoughts. Not a single extra glance, not a single thoughtless remark. Haley tried several times to get him to talk, innocently at first. "How was your day? Is everything okay at the site?" Scott nodded without looking up from his plate. "Yes, as usual. A lot of paperwork." "Aha," she said after a pause. "Have you met Rick? He wanted to give you the calculations." He shrugged. "I didn't see him. Probably forgot. Then I'll catch up." The conversation dried up, as if it had hit a blank wall. Haley glanced at him a couple more times, attentive, slightly tense, but still with that same soft smile on her lips. She clearly noticed something, but pretended that everything was fine. When Cody burst through the door noisily, carried by the evening breeze and the smell of cheap tobacco, the room became a little more crowded, the air a little heavier. He looked into the kitchen with the usual half-smile. His hair was tousled, and there was a backpack on his shoulder, which he immediately got rid of. "Oh, have you already started without me?" he said cheerfully. "That's what it means, right? Once a person leaves for an hour, that's it, they forget." "Hi," Haley answered, quickly getting up. "I'll warm it up for you now." "No, no, no," he waved it off, walking towards the table. "I'll just take the plate from Scott. He's still silent, like a ghost." Scott smiled slightly, kindly. "I'm silent because if I open my mouth, I'll fall asleep right in the soup." The day was not a gift. Cody snorted. "You've been so sleepy for 3 days now, brother. Maybe you need some vitamins, or grandma's recipe tea with rum and a spoon of honey." He sat down, sighed loudly, stretched, and began to pick at the remains of the potatoes in the frying pan. Scott watched him surreptitiously, not directly, out of the corner of his eye. Cody's gestures were, as always, relaxed, lazy, but behind this relaxation there was now an ostentatious negligence. It was as if he was playing his role, a little overdoing it. "You don't think I know, but I do, and soon you will know about it too," Scott thought coldly as he watched Cody joke with Haley about something stupid about their neighbors. He pushed the empty plate away. "I'll go lie down for a while," he said. "If I fall asleep, don't wake me up." Haley glanced at him quickly. "You haven't eaten anything again. Is everything okay?" "Fine," he answered briefly. "It's just, my head is a little buzzing. Maybe we should make some tea." This phrase sounded almost casual, but it resonated like thunder in Scott's head. He shook his head. "Yes, sure. Just come later." "As you say," she nodded softly, but something subtle, almost imperceptible, slipped into her voice. Too quick agreement. Cody didn't say anything. He just grinned, looking at his plate, or maybe into the void. Scott walked out, feeling his heart begin to beat an alarming rhythm in his chest. Towards nightfall, as in previous days, Haley made him herbal tea again. Scott accepted the mug, thanked her, but did not drink. He pretended to drink while she was looking at him, and then, seizing the moment when his wife left the room for a couple of minutes, he poured the contents into the sink. Today, he needed to stay as sober and awake as possible. He won't allow himself to be fooled anymore. Scott lay down on the sofa in the living room with the look of a tired man who had immediately passed out. He told his wife that he felt bad, perhaps had a cold, and therefore would sleep on the sofa so as not to infect her. He even started snoring a little to make it seem more believable. Haley looked out of the bedroom several times to check if her husband was asleep. Making sure that Scott was fast asleep, she disappeared inside. After midnight, the alarming silence that preceded a storm reigned in the house again. Scott, reclining on the couch, quietly took out his phone and opened the camera application. On the screen, in dim black and white, he saw his bedroom. Empty for now. My heart beat faster in anticipation. Anger bubbled up inside him, but he held it back, reminding himself that everything was going according to plan. "Come on, lovebirds. Show me what you are capable of," he thought angrily, not taking his eyes off the screen. He put on his headphones so as not to miss a sound and froze like a predator in ambush, waiting for his prey to appear. Very soon the silence of the night will be torn apart by revealing whispers and moans, and then he will have all the trump cards in his hands. On Scott's phone screen, the bedroom was still empty. It took about 1 in the morning before anything changed. Scott was already starting to worry had they really decided not to meet today. But then the camera recorded movement. The bedroom door slowly opened, letting a dark figure inside. Scott leaned forward, peering. My heart was pounding again with anger and adrenaline. My palms were sweating, squeezing the phone until my knuckles turned white. Scott found himself holding his breath from the tension. The figure approached the bed and came into view of the camera. Haley. She was dressed only in a light silk robe, which she held with her hand, looking over her shoulder. Soon a second shadow joined her. Cody slipped inside the room and closed the door behind him. Scott watched as Haley and Cody tiptoed towards the bed on the screen. The wife whispered something to her brother, who nodded and grinned. Scott couldn't hear the words. He hadn't put on his headphones yet. Now that the prey had appeared, he stuck small wireless earbuds connected to the camera into his ears, and the sound came pouring out. At first, there were only rustles, steps on the carpet, a slight creaking of the mattress springs as Cody sat down on the edge of the bed. Then Haley's muffled voice spoke. "Is he really unconscious?" The voice was a half-whisper, but the camera caught it clearly enough. Scott clenched his fists. "Absolutely," Cody chuckled. "I checked. I even waved my finger in front of my nose, but there was no reaction." Scott felt disgusted. It turns out that when he pretended to be asleep, his brother also mocked him, checking how tightly he was knocked out. "I gave a good dose," Haley whispered, sitting down next to Cody. "He won't wake up until the morning." You're smart, Cody cooed, hugging her waist. Everything is going according to plan, right? Haley sighed and suddenly asked in a plaintive voice, how long will this continue? I'm afraid every time. What are you afraid of? What will he see? Cody chuckled. Even if he has a stake on his head, he won't understand anything. He's not stupid, Cody, Haley countered quietly, can't be underestimated. But in my opinion, he's completely blind, Cody said coldly and pulled her towards him. Let's not talk about him. He kissed Haley. Even through the quiet speakers of his headphones, Scott could hear the wet sound of their kiss. The blood rushed to his head, but he continued to watch. On the screen, the brother deftly pulled off Haley's robe, exposing her body. She didn't resist, on the contrary. She helped by throwing the cloth onto the floor. Cody pulled her onto his lap. God, you're gorgeous, he whispered, kissing her neck. Haley laughed quietly. Hush, she reminded me, don't wake up the neighbor. They both chuckled quietly. Even through the screen, Scott could see his brother grinning disgustingly. This neighbor is sleeping without his hind legs, Cody breathed, laying Haley on the bed and hovering over her. The camera caught their movements quite clearly. We have plenty of time. Scott involuntarily noticed the recording timer in the corner of the screen, 2:15. He continued to record every second of their betrayal. In the video, Cody began to make love to Scott's wife openly. First, quiet moans, whispers. Scott heard every word, every breath. I feel so good with you, Haley breathed. You bet, Cody grinned, speeding up his movements. Your husband doesn't give you that, right? No, it doesn't, she moaned in response. Scott gritted his teeth. This phrase hit me in the gut. But that was just the beginning. After some time, the passion subsided and was replaced by lazy languor. On the screen, the couple, having had their fill, lay down on a rumpled sheet. Haley was lying on Cody's chest. They were both breathing heavily, but already talking quietly. Sometimes I feel sorry for him, Haley suddenly said, barely audible. He's a good person. He was. Scott peered at his wife's face on the screen. She brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. Her expression was thoughtful. You know, I also thought my conscience would torment me, Cody chuckled, stroking her shoulder. But not a bit. After I sat back, this saint lectured me on how to live. And in the end, life's a boring and dull life. He locked you inside four walls and forced you to wait while he worked hard. Don't say that, Haley reprimanded him. He tried for us. What's the point? The brother snorted. For your sake, he always cared only about himself and his pride. You are like a beautiful doll for him. He made you sit at home and is proud that you provided for him. Weren't you lonely? Haley remained silent, turning her face away. Cody lay down next to her and tucked a stray strand behind her ear. Admit it, he said softly. You're better off with me. More fun. You need me more than he does. It's more necessary, she echoed and sighed. Maybe. Scott felt a stab of pain. Despite all the anger, at that moment my heart sank treacherously. So she really stopped loving him. On the screen, Cody pulled Haley close to him and kissed her forehead. Everything will be fine, baby. Soon I will end these conventions and we can be together. Are you talking about a suspended sentence? She asked quietly. Yeah, just have to wait a couple of months. And then maybe we'll go somewhere. Let's start all over again. Without him? Haley said it in a whisper, but the camera caught it. Well, what did you think? Cody grinned. You don't want to continue leading this double life, do you? Haley hesitated. No, I probably don't want to. It's just, it will hurt him. Ha, Cody laughed, but quickly switched to a whisper again. To him? Yes, he will survive. Men forgive this. Maybe he'll be jealous and let him go. I don't know. My wife's voice trembled. I don't want to lose everything. Home, stability. Cody snorted disdainfully. So I'm just entertainment for you. No, Haley whispered hotly, standing up. You know I love you. I'm confused. Cody sighed heavily. They were silent for several seconds. Okay, he whispered conciliatory, Let's not talk about that now. We had a good time, right? And we will carry on until he smells nothing. Scott, sitting on the couch, felt his hands shaking. Every word they said hit my nerves, but he forced himself not to be distracted. This is all being written. Every vile phrase they say. By the way, Cody continued meanwhile, did you take the money? Yes, Haley responded, as you asked. Although I had to lie that I was saving for new furniture. Great, he approved. A couple more trenches like this, and I'll completely pay off that guy. Scott frowned. What are they talking about? It seems that her brother also involved her in some kind of money fraud. What if he notices? Haley asked worriedly. He won't notice, Cody snapped confidently. He trusts you as he trusts himself. You are the wife, the mistress of the budget. Scott gripped the arm of the couch. He had no idea that money was leaking under his nose. Another stab in the back. In the video, Haley suddenly stood up. It's almost 3. You have to go. Suddenly, he will wake up. Yes, yes, Cody agreed reluctantly and got out of bed. He began to get dressed, muttering, I'm so tired of hiding. I wish all this would end. Haley threw on her robe as she approached him. Be patient a little longer. The main thing is don't get caught now, if the probation is revoked. They won't cancel it, he muttered. No one will know anything. He turned and cupped Haley's face in his hands, looking into her eyes. You were amazing, sweetie. You too. She pulled him in for a kiss. At that moment, the numbers 237 flickered on the screen in the corner. The camera captured the last scene. Haley and Cody shared a short goodbye kiss. See you tomorrow, baby, Cody whispered, opening the door. I'll wait for the night. See you tomorrow, she responded, and, touching his nose with her finger playfully, added, and don't forget to climb out through the window, as you were taught. They both laughed quietly. Then Cody ducked into a dark corridor, and Haley smoothly closed the door behind him. She stood for a few more seconds, leaning her forehead against the door, then said quietly, as if to herself, What have I done? Scott saw his wife wipe her eyes with a trembling hand. Did she cry? Maybe, but it no longer bothered him. Haley took a deep breath, ran her hands over her face as if putting on a mask, and went to collect the scattered clothes. A couple of minutes later, she lay down in bed, turning off the light behind her. Scott pressed the stop recording button on his phone. All, end of the performance. He sat motionless for several more minutes, trying to stop the trembling in his body. Evidence has been received, and much became clearer. In addition to betrayal, the financial side was also revealed. Perhaps Cody was blackmailing Haley or getting her involved in some kind of scam. But that doesn't matter anymore. The main thing is that he has irrefutable video and audio of how they cheat and poison him. Scott stood up, his whole body aching from the tension. There was dead silence in the house. He crept into the bedroom and silently took out a tiny camera from behind the curtain, hiding it in his pocket. Then, just as quietly, he slipped back into the living room. Scott sat down at the kitchen table and pulled out his laptop. The hands acted clearly, almost mechanically. He copied the video file from the camera to his hard drive, making several copies at once just in case. He transferred one file to a flash drive inserted into the port. The other one was uploaded to a password-protected cloud storage. Now, even if someone destroys one carrier, the evidence will not be lost. Then he opened his email. There was already a letter from the laboratory, the results of the analysis. Scott eagerly scanned the text with his eyes. The sample provided contained high doses of the sleeping pill Zopiclone. Everything was coming together. Haley slipped a powerful sleeping pill into his tea. The official conclusion of the examination was available. He immediately printed the document on his home printer. It took another half hour to write a statement to the police. Line by line, Scott laid out the facts. Suspected poisoning, the names of the suspects, the presence of video and audio evidence, the results of the analysis. He indicated that he intended to hand over all the materials to law enforcement officers. Having printed and signed the application, he placed it, along with a copy of the laboratory report, in an envelope. It was already past 5 in the morning when Scott, having brought his preparations to perfection, finally allowed himself to lean back in his chair. The sleepless night was coming to an end. Today will be a long day, a day of reckoning. A tired, bitter smile appeared on Scott's face. He looked at the flash drive lying on the table, then at the stack of printed papers. Everything is ready. Well, he said quietly into the emptiness of the kitchen. You're way out, my dear. It's time to pay the bills. It was a surprisingly quiet morning at the Brenner house. Haley was busy at the stove, preparing breakfast, scrambled eggs and bacon. Cody hadn't come down yet, probably sleeping off his night's adventures. Scott sat at the kitchen table, his fingers interlocked, and watched dispassionately as his wife scurried around the kitchen. Her appearance, her housecoat, her hair tied up in a bun now seemed to Scott like a mask behind, which was hiding a completely different person. But it's okay, soon this mask will fall off. Wake up, Cody, please, Haley said over her shoulder. Otherwise, everything will cool down. Scott stood up silently. On the way to the living room, he furtively pressed a couple of buttons on the smartphone lying on the cabinet, activating the media player pre-connected to the TV. Then he walked up to the stairs and shouted, Hey, sleepyhead, get up. Breakfast is getting cold. A minute later, heavy footsteps tramped down. Cody appeared, disheveled, but, oddly enough, in high spirits. Good morning, family, he grinned, sitting down at the table and inhaling the aroma of bacon. What will you enjoy today? Scott sank into his seat, glancing briefly at his brother. He seemed smug. Meanwhile, Haley set out the plates and cups. Eat, she said cheerfully. Everything is ready. The trio ate in silence for several minutes. Scott waited. He needed both of them to relax a little, to get back into their normal routine. He felt like everything inside was buzzing with tension. The moment of truth was near. Cody was the first to break the silence. Why are you so quiet? Like funerals. Haley smiled tightly. It's a simple morning. It was a hard night. She glanced briefly at her husband. He drank coffee without saying a word. Yeah, Cody chuckled, especially for some. You passed out so bad yesterday, brother. It was as if you had fallen into a coma. We barely woke up. Scott slowly set the mug down on the table. He looked up at his brother. But I see you had a great time without me, he said calmly with a cold smile. The giddy expression left Cody's face. He frowned. What are you talking about? Haley also froze, holding her fork in the air. Scott slowly rose from the table. I think we should all watch something, he said, looking first at his wife, then at his brother. Before dessert. What to see? Haley's voice trembled. Scott didn't answer. He walked into the living room, just beyond the archway from the kitchen, and picked up the remote control from the table. Scott? Haley called, following him. What are you doing? Cody also stood up, suddenly feeling something was wrong. Scott pressed the button. The screen of the large TV hanging on the living room wall flashed. You'll see now, he said quietly and pressed play. At first, only a rustling sound was heard. A dark, blurry image of the bedroom appeared on the screen. Shot in night mode, it cast a greenish light. What the hell? Cody breathed, looking intently at the screen. Haley stepped closer, peering, and suddenly turned pale. Figures clearly appeared on the screen, a man and a woman on a bed. A woman is herself, a wife. The man is not Scott at all. And no, Haley croaked, grabbing the back of the sofa with her hand. This can't be. But the TV speakers were already spilling muffled moans and whispers into the room. I gave him a good dose. He won't wake up until the morning. Haley's voice said from the screen. The living Haley gasped, putting her hands to her mouth. Her gaze darted between the screen and her husband. Scott stood nearby, crossing his arms over his chest, silently watching the scene. You filmed us? Cody exhaled, his face flushed with either rage or fear. Scott turned his head towards him. A predatory smile touched his lips. Why not? It turned out to be an unusual movie, right? How do you like it, brother? Filmed with cinematic precision, I would say. Scott. Haley croaked, "Please, it's not what you think." Her eyes were already filled with tears, but Scott didn't even raise an eyebrow. "Not what I think." He pointed his finger at the screen, where Cody and Haley were already having sex with all their might, not hesitating either in words or in moans. "Are you saying you didn't sleep with each other here?" Haley charges. I didn't mean to, Scott. I didn't mean to hurt you." "But you really wanted to have sex with my brother," he spat in her face, finally giving free rein to his voice. "Right behind me in my own house. Hey, take it easy." Cody started, taking a step forward, but Scott raised his hand, stopping him. "Stop. One more step and you'll regret it," he said coldly. Cody glanced at the screen. Now there was that same scene where he makes Haley say that her husband doesn't give her anything. Cody's face twitched. "Turn the fuck off," he said threateningly. "Now." "What, you don't like looking at yourself from the outside?" Scott responded with poisonous politeness. "And by the way, I wasn't very pleased either, especially listening to my brother call me a blind saint. Or this, you and your husband are bored and lonely. Very entertaining." Haley covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking from sobs. Cody stepped towards the TV, clearly intending to stop this spanking, but Scott, anticipating this, instantly found himself at the outlet and pulled out the cord, turning off the power to the TV. The screen went dark, but what was needed was already shown. "You son of a bitch." Cody wheezed, digesting what he saw. His face was distorted with malice, pent-up anger trembled at the corners of his lips, and his eyes filled with dark, predatory malice. "Yes, we were asleep." "And what?" he muttered defiantly. "It's your own fault, brother. Couldn't satisfy my own wife. She needed a real man," he spat, grinning contemptuously, as if he was deliberately finishing off. It was as if something had snapped inside Scott. It's cracked. The world shrank to one point and the next second exploded. He no longer heard any sounds or words, only his heavy, frantic pulse in his temples. Not remembering himself, he rushed forward like a wild animal, and his fist crashed into Cody's jaw with a dull, wet sound. He did not expect the blow and fell back. Knocking the floor lamp sideways, it fell with a roar, splashing the lamp and dropping the light to the side, causing the whole room to be painted with disturbing shadows. Haley screamed briefly, but her voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. Cody shook his head, had difficulty focusing, swore and spat thick blood from his cut lip. He tried to get up, unsteadily, but Scott was already there, looming over him, his fists clenched until his knuckles were white. There was only one thing in his eyes: rage. Not hysterical, not outburst, cold, tortured, accumulated drop by drop. "You, scum." He exhaled and hit him with renewed force in the cheekbone from a roundhouse, so that Cody flew onto his side, painfully hitting his shoulder against the wall. "Scott, don't," Haley shouted, rushing between them, but it was too late. Scott, choking with rage, kicked Cody in the stomach. He wheezed, doubled up, and curled up on the floor. "Did you think I didn't notice anything?" Scott yelled, his voice breaking into a dull growl. "Did you think you could just come into my house like that, have sex with my wife and laugh behind my back?" He stepped forward again, swinging, but Haley rushed forward, grabbing his arm. "Scott, please, enough. You will kill him." He froze, breathing heavily, his fist shaking. Cody groaned as he tried to crawl towards the wall. His face was bloody, his lips were swollen, and one eye began to turn purple. His gaze was angry, but caution already appeared in it, bordering on fear. Now he understood his brother was ready to go to the end. Scott pulled his hand out of his wife's grip, but didn't hit her. He looked at them both with hatred that he could no longer and did not want to hide. His chest heaved. His entire essence, everything he built, everything he believed in collapsed in an instant, and now two people whom he had once considered close stood on the ruins. Scott's eyes burned with an icy fire. He grabbed his brother by the collar of his shirt and leaned close to his face. "Repeat," he hissed. "Come on, repeat, carrion." Cody wheezed, wincing in pain, but stubbornly wheezed. "Fuck you." Scott raised his fist again, but at the last moment he let go of his brother, pushing him against the wall. "You don't deserve me to dirty my hands on you," he said contemptuously. Cody stood up, breathing heavily, wiping his split lip with the back of his hand. "You will answer me for this," he muttered angrily. Scott picked up the papers from the floor, the police statement, and the results of the examination, and turned again to the traders. There was tense silence for several seconds, broken only by Haley's sobs. "Well," Scott said slowly, "since the morning session is over, let's discuss the consequences." Cody was breathing heavily, glaring wildly at his brother, but didn't move yet. Scott turned to his wife. "Take your hands off your face," he said harshly. Haley shook her head and continued to sob. Then Scott suddenly grabbed her wrists and yanked her arms down. Her tear-stained face, distorted with horror, appeared before him. "Look at me," he muttered. "I want you to remember this moment well." Haley sobbed and, trembling, looked up at her husband. "Scott, I'm sorry. Please." She breathed out shakily. Anger flared in his eyes. "Sorry? Do you even understand what you're saying?" Scott let go of her and took a thin stack of papers, folded in four, from his inner pocket. "After everything you have done, do you still dare to ask for forgiveness?" He unfolded the papers and threw them on the coffee table in front of the sofa. The printed sheets fanned out. "This is a police report," Scott said, "about an attempt on my health by mixing drugs without my knowledge. And here," he pointed to another sheet, "the laboratory's conclusion, zopiclone, a potent sleeping pill, was found in my body. Do you recognize it? The same thing you poured into my mug every night, Haley." Haley sighed convulsively, unable to cry anymore. The tears dried up, leaving only pale despair. "God, Scott, I didn't know what to do," she whispered, kneeling directly on the floor. "This is all a mistake." "Error?" Scott snapped, leaning towards her. "The mistake is that I married you." Haley began to sob again, trying to hug his legs, but he retreated, not allowing himself to be touched. Cody, seeing his sister-in-law's broken state, tried to take control of the situation. He picked up the statement from the table and ran his eyes briefly. "Did you just say something like slander?" He chuckled nervously. "Brother, come on, it's our own people. We'll decide within the family." "Don't you dare call me brother," Scott snapped, piercing him with his gaze. "And even more so, our own. I don't have a brother anymore. My brother died last night. Instead of him, in front of me is a petty scumbag, whom I will lead to prison by the scruff of the neck with my own hand." Cody threw the papers on the floor. "Fuck you. You won't lead me anywhere." He quickly moved towards the door, clearly intending to escape. But I didn't have time. Heavy footsteps were heard on the porch, and a second later the doorbell rang. Scott chuckled at the corner of his mouth. "And here are the guests. It seems on time." Cody froze in the middle of the living room. Haley raised her swollen eyes to the door. The call was repeated, more insistently. Scott headed into the hallway. "It seems it's behind you, brother." The door swung open. Two uniformed policemen stood on the threshold. "Scott Branner," one said, looking at the man standing in the doorway. "Yes, it's me," Scott nodded. "You're just in time, officers. Come on in." The police crossed the threshold. In the living room behind Scott, a picture of destruction opened up. An overturned stool, scattered papers, a woman on the floor, and a man frozen in indecision in the center of the room. "What happened here?" the second officer asked, frowning. "It's okay," Scott answered calmly. "It was these people that I indicated in my statement. Cody Branner," he pointed to his brother, "that's him. His suspended sentence is subject to revocation for the crime committed, and this is my wife, Haley, his accomplice." Haley, hearing the words accomplice, sobbed quietly, but didn't even raise her head. Cody finally started to move. He raised his hands, pretending to give up, and muttered, "Well, brother, you snitched on the police. Are you proud of yourself?" Scott silently looked at him with an icy gaze. One of the officers stepped forward. "Cody Branner?" "He's the one," Cody said, crossing his arms. "Come with us." You are detained for violating the terms of parole and on suspicion of poisoning, the policeman said clearly. Stand facing the wall, hands behind your head. Yes, no problem, Cody grinned, although the corners of his lips twitched nervously. He reluctantly turned to face the wall. The second officer twisted his hands and handcuffed him. What, brother? I took a video and sent it straight to the cops, right? Cody said over his shoulder sarcastically. Somehow not like a man. Shut up, Scott said calmly. You have no idea what it means to be a man. We'll see which of us is worth what, hissed the handcuffed brother. The officers began to lead him to the door. As Cody passed Scott, he suddenly jerked and stopped, looking at his brother point blank. Hatred blazed in his eyes. You will pay for this, do you hear? I'll try my best, but you'll regret it. The police pulled the detainee, dragging him to the exit. Scott didn't flinch. He looked after his brother, distraught with rage, and felt emptiness. No pity, no compassion, just cold satisfaction. For a moment, the image of 10-year-old, curly-haired Cody, the same younger brother whom Scott had once protected from bullies in the yard and pulled out of nasty troubles, arose in his memory. Then he could not even imagine that everything would end like this. He couldn't help remembering how, as a boy, Cody would threaten to take revenge on him whenever Scott caught him stealing or lying. Those threats meant nothing then, and they don't mean anything now. Take him away, he told the police. I handed over the evidence to the police station. The applicant will remain in touch, one of the officers confirmed, nodding. They took Cody out onto the porch. For a moment, the morning sun blinded everyone. There was another policeman standing by the car parked on the side of the road. Seeing his colleagues with a detainee, he opened the back door of the patrol car. Cody, continuing to shout threats and curses, was pushed inside. The door slammed shut. The police took their places in front, and the car with its flashing lights turned on moved off. Soon she disappeared around the bend of the street. Scott stood on the porch with his arms crossed. My brother's farewell shout was still ringing in my ears. You'll regret it. He involuntarily remembered the boy Cody, who always threatened to take revenge when he was caught doing tricks. Then these threats only caused a smile as now. Shuffling steps were heard behind him. Haley walked out onto the porch, wrapping herself in a thin robe as if she was shaking. Her face was wet with tears, her eyes were glassy. She silently stared at the retreating police car. Is he going back to prison? She asked hoarsely, either to Scott or to herself. Naturally, Scott didn't even turn to look at her. He will have his parole revoked and a new sentence for poisoning. Haley sobbed. Lord, what have we done? Scott chuckled coldly as he continued to look ahead. It's too late for repentance. She began to sob, covering her face with her hands. Scott stood for a couple more seconds, watching as the sun rose fully above the roofs of the neighboring houses, flooding the street with light. A new morning of his life was dawning. He turned and looked down at Haley. She sank onto the threshold, sitting right on the wooden boards, and quietly sobbed. Once beautiful and proud, she now looked like a pathetic, broken creature. But Scott didn't feel sorry for her. Get up, he said harshly. We need to discuss something. Haley looked up at him with reddened eyes. What? Scott had already turned around and was walking back into the house. Now you'll find out, he said over his shoulder. Come in. She reluctantly got up and followed. The door closed, cutting off the street and the sun. A difficult conversation awaited them inside the house. Haley froze in the middle of the living room, clutching the hem of her robe with shaking hands. Scott walked past her and sat down in a chair. His gaze was unreadable. Sit down, he pointed to the sofa opposite. She sat down hesitantly, continuing to sob. They sat in silence for several moments. Scott broke the silence in a cold, matter-of-fact tone, as if he were talking about a stranger. To begin with, our marriage is over. Today, I am filing for divorce. Haley closed her eyes from the pain of these words, but nodded barely. She herself understood that it could not be otherwise. I understand, she whispered. I deserve. She deserved much worse, Scott agreed harshly. But I'm not going to get my hands any more dirty than you forced me to. He leaned forward, glaring at her with a hard gaze. You destroyed everything, Haley. 12 years of marriage down the drain. And for what? For a few months of fun with my criminal brother. Was normal life and stability not enough for you? Please, don't, she whispered pleadingly, covering her face with her palms. I know I'm to blame. Don't blame me like that. Don't reproach. Scott suddenly raised his voice, jumping up. After everything you've done, are you still asking for leniency? Haley perked up and also jumped up, suddenly speaking heatedly and haltingly. I know I have no excuse, but understand. I was lonely. You were constantly at work. You came tired in the evenings. I felt abandoned. And then Cody. He paid attention to me, said such things. I lost my head. I didn't think that everything would go so far. Didn't you think so? Scott smiled bitterly. Poisoning your husband with sleeping pills, this, in your opinion, did not go far. Haley began to sob louder. I was afraid. I was afraid that you would find out. I was a coward, yes. I could neither leave you nor stop. Everything got out of control. Scott silently listened to her hysteria, crossing his arms. When she fell silent, wiping away her tears, he said coldly, Enough. Now it doesn't matter what you felt or what you were afraid of. It's over. You understand this yourself. She nodded, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. Yes, it's over. If that's the case, let's get down to business. Scott sank back into the chair. I'm divorcing you as soon as possible, and I'll try to make sure you don't get a cent. Haley perked up. But according to the law, adultery and criminal conspiracy are excellent grounds for depriving a wife of her rights, he snapped. I will take care of this through the courts. But he has already taken action. With that, he took out his phone and opened something, then turned the screen towards her. A bank account was open there. Do you see this remnant? He showed the balance. The account is almost empty. These are our joint savings. Or rather, no longer. I withdrew all the money to a separate account in my name. You no longer have access to them. Haley gasped. Scott, but these are also mine. You're wrong. After what you did, I don't think you have the right to claim them. Scott put the phone away. This time, to home. He nodded towards the walls surrounding them. It was a cozy house, which they furnished together, choosing furniture and paint for the walls. Now every corner here hurt Scott's eyes with a reminder of the lie. I already contacted the bank this morning, he continued, and he mortgaged the house. I took out a loan secured by real estate. Haley widened her eyes. You? What? For what? So that in the event of a division of property, you have nothing to divide, he said. The house actually belongs to the bank until I pay off the loan. But I'm in no hurry, so whatever you want, take half of the debt for yourself. Her lips trembled. But where should I go now? Scott stood up abruptly. You should have thought about this earlier. He came close to her, hanging over her. I'll leave you with what you came to my house 12 years ago, nothing. No money, no shelter. Did you want freedom? Get it in full. Haley looked at him, pale as a sheet. Are you? Kicking me out. What did you expect? He exploded. That we will continue to live under the same roof, as if nothing had happened. She shook her head desperately. No, of course. But maybe, for a while, I have nowhere. You can ask your parents, Scott grinned. Tell them why your husband kicked you out. Haley started crying again. Scott, I beg you. At least something. At least a little money. Enough, he barked, losing patience. Not a cent. Do you even understand what I went through? You destroyed me yesterday. She took it and trampled it, as if I were dirt under my feet. He breathed heavily, peering into her face, distorted by suffering. I loved you, Scott hissed. I, idiot, doted on you. I thought everything was fine with us. I planned the future. And you. He closed his eyes and smiled bitterly. Do you know what's most offensive? Not that you slept with someone else, and the fact that it turned me into a fool. You both treated me like an idiot, sleeping pills and tea, laughter behind your back. Haley swallowed convulsively. Sorry, sorry. I won't forgive you, he snapped. Never. He turned away. He stood there for several seconds, shaking from the surging feelings. He clenched his fists until it hurt. Haley even stepped towards him, as if she wanted to console him, to touch him, but he barked without turning around. Don't you dare come closer. She froze. Scott exhaled, gripping the back of the chair as if regaining his composure. You have an hour to pack your things, he said in a colorless voice. Take what you need and get out. Haley looked around the house, her face contorted in horror. Where should I? It's none of my business, Scott shrugged. Do you want to go to a friend? Do you want to go to Mom and Dad? You can come to Cody's bunk. You are the love of your life. He grinned evilly. Haley covered her face with her hands, realizing there was no argument. She slowly walked up the stairs, apparently to the bedroom to pack her things. Scott watched her go. A heavy fatigue covered my soul. There was chaos all around. A dining table with half-eaten breakfast, an overturned stool, abandoned documents. 12 years of life in ruins, like this room. He picked up the statement from the floor, torn in the corner. However, it has already done its job. An hour later, Haley came downstairs with her travel bag. She changed into jeans and a sweater and pulled her hair under a cap. His eyes were red and swollen from crying, his shoulders drooped. Just in the morning, there was a sleek, self-confident woman in front of him, but now she was just a pale shadow. Haley tried not to meet his gaze. Scott waited at the door, coldly silent. Haley put down her bag and said with difficulty, Can I have the last word? He nodded, pursing his lips. Valet. She looked up at him, full of despair and belated love. I'm sorry. I know you won't forgive, but I loved you. In my own way. Always loved. I'm sorry. Scott looked at her with a long, hard look that made her want to sink into the ground. Finally, he said quietly, If I had loved you, I wouldn't have done what I did. He opened the door. Cold air hit Haley's face. Goodbye, Scott said quietly, and don't come back. Haley lowered her head. She grabbed her bag and staggered out onto the porch. The door slammed behind her with frightening decisiveness, cutting her off from the past. He stood at the door for a long time, without moving, listening to the steps beyond the threshold uneven, as if she was stumbling, as if her legs no longer obeyed. Then silence. No voice, no engine sound, no trunk slam. Only the wind humming in the opening. He slowly closed the door. The click of the lock sounded deafening in this new silence, empty, final. Scott remained standing, leaning his forehead against the cold wood, as if hoping that he could hold back the storm that had come from within. But it was already here, not loud, not explosive, but slow, viscous, like blood from a deep wound. He stepped back and looked around the hallway. The smell of her perfume still lingered here. Her jacket was hanging on the hanger she forgot. Or maybe she left it on purpose. He turned away and walked deeper into the house, as if trying to escape from the ghosts. In the living room, everything was as before, neat, homely. Only the floor lamp lay on its side, as a reminder of yesterday's anger. He didn't pick it up. He walked by as if he didn't notice. He sank into a chair. He sat down heavily, with a tired exhalation, as if the whole weight of those words that he did not have time to say fell on his shoulders. Those feelings that are now forever in the past. How could she? This question pulsed in my head, persistently, almost physically. Didn't give me any rest. He tried to imagine. At what point did she stop being his, when it was between them that a crack formed, into which his own brother silently but swiftly penetrated? He remembered everything. Their first evenings, how she laughed when he read a book out loud to her, how she hid her face in his chest after a bad dream, as she whispered, "You are my home." And this is her, the same woman who looked into his eyes while holding Cody's hand, the one who lied every day without flinching, preparing him dinner, hugging him good night. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. And Cody, brother, the person they shared their childhood with, secrets, scars, He trusted him as he trusted himself. He was allowed into the house at one table, and all this time, they slept behind him. Not once, not out of stupidity. It was treason with premeditation, with composure, a betrayal in which he became the last one to know the truth. He stood up abruptly, walked around the room, then sat down again. Why didn't I notice anything? Or didn't I want to notice? Was I blind, or did I just believe too much? No tears came. Too much inside has burned out in recent days. All that was left was emptiness and heavy awareness. His love was real. What about her? In your own way, as she said. He smiled bitterly. In your own way is not enough, so it's temporary. He leaned his head back on the chair and closed his eyes. For the first time in a long time, not for sleep, but just to switch off. Can't see the walls. Don't feel. Don't think. At least for a minute. Scott slowly drove up to a familiar house in another part of town. The one-story red brick house with a white porch is the home of Haley's parents. Here, 10 years ago, they celebrated their first Thanksgiving together. Then her father shook Scott's hand tightly and called him son. Now everything is different. Sitting in the car, Scott looked at the house for a while. There was someone else's car in the driveway. Apparently a neighbor or relative was visiting. It didn't matter to him. He took out a small flash drive from his jacket pocket. Only the initials SB were marked on it with a black marker. Scott got out of the car and walked towards the front door. His heart beat evenly. He had neither doubts nor pity. He was determined to see the matter through to the end. Margaret, Haley's mother, opened the door. Seeing Scott on the threshold, she blinked in confusion. Scott, God, what happened? Haley showed up early today, all in tears. She says you had a fight. There was concern and hidden reproach in her voice. In the depths of the house, Scott heard a man's voice, probably his father, Howard, was also somewhere nearby. Scott nodded modestly. Good morning, Margaret. Pardon the intrusion. I need to talk to you and Howard. This is important. Of course. Come in. The mother stepped back, letting him through. We were just. Did you have breakfast? No need, Scott refused, entering the hallway. He found the whole family in the living room. The usual family photographs hung on the wall, including a wedding portrait of him and Haley, where they were both beaming with happiness. The corners of Scott's lips twitched with a bitter smile. Haley was sitting on the sofa, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes red from tears. Her father, gloomy and preoccupied, sat next to him on a chair. Haley's Aunt Sandra stood by the fireplace with a mug of coffee. Apparently, she came to support her niece's screams in the morning. Everyone turned to Scott. Son, what's going on? Howard stood up heavily. Can you explain it to us? Haley doesn't really say anything, just cries. Scott turned his gaze to his wife, who was cowering under the blanket, avoiding his eyes. He grinned. Doesn't speak? Well, of course. Probably a shame. Scott. Aunt Sandra said reproachfully, she says you kicked her out of the house. It's true, he calmly confirmed. Kicked me out. Margaret clasped her hands. Lord, why? What happened between you? Scott took the flash drive out of his pocket and held it up, showing it to everyone. The answer to all questions is here. Haley glanced at the carrier in his fingers and suddenly turned chalk pale. No, she whispered. Please. Her father tensed. What is this? Scott looked at his father-in-law. This is a video, a recording you and Margaret should see. I advise children and strangers. He looked meaningfully at Sandra. She was embarrassed, but still did not move from her place. Howard's frown deepened. I don't need any notes. I want to hear from you too. Look, Dad, Haley suddenly said hoarsely, standing up. Her gaze darted between her parents and her husband. There. Everything is not true there. It's Cody. It's not me. Scott winced at her pathetic lie. It's not too late to stop lying, Haley, he said angrily. Don't talk to my daughter like that. Howard snapped, defending her reflexively. Howard. Scott turned to his father-in-law, lowering his voice. I respect you very much. That's why I'm here. It pains me to say and show this, But believe me, there is no other way. He handed the flash drive to Haley's father. He hesitated. Nearby, Margaret pressed her hands to her chest in confusion, desperately looking first at her daughter and then at her son-in-law. "Take it," she said quietly to her husband. "We need to understand what happened." Howard slowly took the carrier. "What's on it?" he asked dully. "Like I said, answers," Scott responded. He looked at Haley, who was shaking her head as if scared. I, I just slept with Cody," she suddenly shouted hysterically. "But I'm only to blame for Scott. This doesn't concern you, Dad." There was a ringing silence. Margaret gasped and covered her mouth. Howard's face turned red. "What did you say?" growled at the father. Haley realized that she had said too much and collapsed back onto the couch, sobbing. Scott smiled bitterly. "You see, and on the recording not only that, there you can see and hear your daughter in my house." He stopped short, realizing that he didn't want to reprimand his father-in-law like that. "In general, you better see for yourself, and hear how she poisoned me with sleeping pills so that I wouldn't wake up." Margaret screamed. "Haley, this is true." Scott's wife couldn't find anything to answer. She just cried, shaking her head. Howard turned to her, his face stony. "Abomination. What an abomination." He looked at Scott, and his eyes sparkled with tears. "Forgive us, son. We didn't know that she was capable of such." Scott shook his head. "You have nothing to do with it. I just want you to know the truth." He straightened up, steeling himself to leave. "I have to go. Then figure it out for yourself." Margaret sobbed. "What? What will happen now?" Scott turned to her. "Now Haley is a free woman. Let him live as he knows. I'm getting a divorce." Howard clutched the flash drive in his hand, his gaze fixed on the floor. "We will understand everything. And God bless you, son. You don't deserve it." There was bitterness and shame in his voice. Scott nodded. "Thank you." He had nothing more to say. He turned and walked out of the living room with long strides, leaving sobs and exclamations of shock behind. He went out onto the porch, taking a deep breath of cold air. He suddenly felt completely at ease. The weight that had been pressing on my heart for days seemed to fall away. Now it's all over. The truth has come out. Once in the car, Scott took one last look at the house. In the living room window, he saw alarmed silhouettes. It seemed that Howard was saying something sharply to his daughter. She fell to her knees. Aunt Sandra groaned, shaking her head. Scott looked away and started the engine. It's time to leave this behind. In the living room of the house, Howard, still clutching the ill-fated flash drive, stood over his daughter. Haley knelt at his feet, sobbing and trying to grab her father's hand. "Dad, Daddy, forgive me." She burst into tears. Howard recoiled, his face turning purple with anger. "Don't you dare call me that," he shouted, pulling his hand away. "What have you done, Haley? Is this how we raised you? You poisoned your husband, played tricks under his very nose. How did you even have enough conscience?" I don't know." She sobbed. "I was stupid. It's all Cody. He deceived me." "Shut up," Howard barked. "Don't you dare put the blame on someone else. You are an adult, but you behave like an irresponsible teenager." Haley covered her face with trembling hands. Aunt Sandra pressed her hand to her chest, looking at her niece with horror. Margaret sat whiter than chalk. Finally, she took her husband by the elbow. "Howard, calm down." He took his hand away. "No, Margaret, let her know what I think." He turned back to his daughter. "I don't recognize you. Who are you after this, huh? How could you destroy everything like that?" Haley whined subtly. "Daddy, I'm sorry. I'm so ashamed. I'll fix everything, honestly." Howard was breathing heavily. Then he said low, "To correct? How? You have already lost your husband. Moreover, she almost killed him. You're lucky he didn't file a report against you. Think about it." He shook his head in disgust. I need to cool down. Stand up." Haley stumbled to her feet, sobbing. Howard turned to his wife and sister. "I'm going out into the yard to get some fresh air. Margaret, give her some water. and throwing another look at his daughter, full of disappointment, he left through the back door. When he disappeared, Margaret quietly walked up to Haley and touched her shoulder. "Sit down, baby," she said, pain and pity mixed in her voice. "Hush. We'll figure something out." But Haley only sank helplessly onto the sofa and buried her face in her hands. She understood that nothing could be returned. 6 months have passed. Just 6 months, but it feels like a lifetime. Scott Branner seemed like a different person to himself. And yet, in the mirror he recognized himself now reserved, slightly older, with tired but clear eyes. There was still a deep crack in the soul, but it no longer hurt, did not bleed, it healed, leaving a scar as a reminder. Not about the pain, about the strength with which he managed to survive the betrayal. The divorce happened quickly. Irrefutable evidence helped analysis of intercepted messages, recording from a camera in the hallway. The court, with barely a glance at the case, sided with Scott. The house was left to him. It's ironic, after all, it was this house, which until recently seemed like a fortress, that became a cell for him. He quickly realized that he would not be able to live in it. It reminded me too much. Even the creaking of the floorboard in the hallway echoed with betrayal. So he sold it and never regretted it. A new life began with a clean slate. Now he had a small cottage by the lake, cozy, paneled with light wood, with a wide porch and glass doors overlooking the water. It was only half an hour's drive from the city, but it seemed as if here, among the pine trees and the mirror-like surface of the lake, everything was in a different reality. It was easy to breathe here. The spring evening was fresh and clear. The air smelled of damp earth, pine needles, and smoke. From afar someone had lit a fireplace. The foliage on the trees was just beginning to awaken, soft green, almost transparent. Scott sat on the steps of the porch, his hands spread out on his knees, his head slightly lowered as if he was listening to the ground. Lying nearby was Buster, a young retriever with fluffy fur and endlessly loyal eyes. He was found in a shelter, thin, trembling, with a wary look, but Scott immediately understood. They needed each other. Now the dog was healthy, happy, and seemed to understand his owner's every move. His breathing was measured, but his ears trembled slightly. He was alert, sensitive to everything. Scott reached out and stroked him between his ears. Buster snorted, without opening his eyes, and contentedly shifted closer like a dog, pressing his side. "Well done," Scott whispered. "You're my friend now, do you hear? We are no longer beholden to anyone, only to each other." Laughter came from the house light, lively, hoarse. He turned around, stood on the threshold. Kelly. She was wearing a soft sweater and light jeans. Her hair was pulled back into a messy bun, with strands of it falling out, highlighted by the orange sunset light. In her hands, she held a tray with 2 mugs. Fragrant steam rose from them. "The tea is ready," she said, and her voice sounded like music. "Chamomile with mint. How you love." Scott stood up and walked towards her, carefully accepting the tray and helping her lower it onto the wooden table. Her hand lingered on his fingers for a moment, and Scott's heart sank, not from pain, but from unexpected joy. So quiet, almost forgotten, like the morning after a long storm. "Thank you, Kel," he said quietly. "Here," she replied, handing him one of the mugs. "Just be careful, he's hot." He took it, and his fingers touched again. Nothing special, just the warmth of a living person. But how much it meant now. At first, after the divorce, he thought that he already had no trust. Words, looks, to touch. He was afraid that any show of concern was false. But Kelly was different. She was in no hurry. I didn't delve into his past. She's just nearby. I listened. She spoke. She was silent when necessary. He met her by chance at a farmer's market. We started talking. Then again. And then somehow it naturally turned out that they were walking together. They drink coffee. They laugh. They write to each other and get bored. And for several months now she has been part of his world. Scott took a sip. Hot, burning. For a moment he was overcome by a strange feeling. Memory flashed inside like distant thunder. That tea. Bitterness. Fatigue. He froze. Then I listened to the taste chamomile mint, a little linden, purely, gently, no falsehood. He exhaled and looked at Kelly. She watched him carefully. Tasty? She asked with a slight smile. Scott put his mug down and nodded. Great tea. The best I've ever drunk. Kelly smiled contentedly, and Buster, hearing the voice, raised his head, stretched, and pricked up his ears. Somewhere in the reeds frogs were calling to each other. There was almost no wind. The water in the lake was mirror smooth, silvery from the sunset. The hunter over there is interested, Kelly laughed, watching the puppy. Scott patted the dog on the withers. You are my good one. Everything is new to him. Everything is like the first time. Kelly looked at him softly. What are you thinking about? He turned slightly to her and smiled at the corners of his lips. I'm just happy that I have you. She extended her hand and covered his hand with hers. And we are glad that you are with us. And there was more in these simple words than in any oath. Buster suddenly rolled over onto his back, threw his paws up, squealing demandingly. Scott and Kelly laughed. Scott leaned down and scratched the dog's furry belly. The puppy closed his eyes with happiness. Spoiled, Scott said with a smile, but we're all a little spoiled now. We can afford it. A flock of birds flew over the roof. A pockmarked reflection lay on the water. The sunset painted the sky a soft peach hue. The evening was warm, like the hands of a beloved woman, and Scott suddenly realized. He is free. From fear, from pain, from lies. The year without looking back. He took the mug again and inhaled the aroma. Deep, herbal, truly homey. No catch, no falsehood. Kelly, without letting go of his hand, looked at him silently. There was acceptance in her gaze, and light. He raised his mug as if raising a toast. Here's to a new beginning. For the future, she replied, slamming her mug against his. They each took a sip. The tea was warm, life too. Scott put down his mug and looked at Kelly. She waited. He leaned towards her, touched her lips, and in this kiss, there was no pain, no resentment, no fear. Only pure, quiet happiness, the taste of which he had almost forgotten. But now he knew he would never let go of again. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.